Jewish life in the German Empire had been a life of contradictions. Though unification in the 19th century had brought equality before the law, anti-Semitism had continued to feature in imperial politics, and Jews were still informally barred from most high-status positions in the military, civil service, and academia. Despite that, the Jewish population was actually doing far better economically than the country as a whole. While typically they may have been blackballed from teaching at universities, those who could afford to attend were welcome to do so, and many parlayed their educations into lucrative jobs in law, medicine, business, and the applied sciences. Even Jewish men who couldn't afford university usually had access to trade schools and apprenticeships by virtue of living almost entirely in cities. That isn't to say that the entire Jewish population was financially secure. By 1914, Germany was home to over 100,000 Jewish refugees from the neighboring Russian Empire, denied citizenship by the imperial government, living precarious lives, and facing discrimination even from their fellow Jews. But overall, the situation was good enough for a large enough number of people that they could put their lingering indignities aside and celebrate the advances they'd made. With the outbreak of the First World War, the normal barriers were suspended, resulting in an influx of Jews into military officer ranks and wartime industry. But Germany's failure to achieve a swift victory in the war inspired an anti-Semitic backlash. Under pressure from ultranationalist politicians, the German army instituted the Judendzählung, an intentionally flawed survey that was meant to prove allegations that Jews were avoiding military service. This was controversial enough to provoke a backlash from liberals and socialists in the Reichstag, particularly the German Democrats, Social Democrats, Independent Social Democrats, and Center. Though they succeeded in stopping the Judendzählung, their subsequent efforts to bring a negotiated end to the war fell on deaf ears. But these four parties would have the last laugh when the war ended. While Germany may have failed to achieve a swift victory in 1914, the same was true of the Entente Allies, with 3 years of inconclusive fighting and tens of millions dead on both sides. Finally, in late summer 1918, the Allies combined new tactics and technology to make decisive breakthroughs on the Palestine, Macedonian, and Western fronts. By the 3rd of November, Germany was the last of the Central Powers still standing, at which point soldiers, sailors, and factory workers rose up in revolt. Under Allied pressure, the monarchist military establishment effectively disbanded, and on the 9th of November, Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. Hoping to fend off a communist revolution, Social Democratic Deputy Philipp Scheidemann took the initiative and declared the establishment of the German Republic. The next day, the two factions of the SPD established a new cabinet, the Council of People's Deputies, which included no fewer than 3 Jewish ministers. The main goals of the council were to negotiate an end to the war, establish a new, more democratic order, and hold back the communist threat, which was no joke. Following a brief skirmish on Christmas Eve, Germany's communist hardliners organized a general strike in opposition to the Social Democrats, but were defeated by an increasingly powerful and right-wing cadre of government-backed irregulars known as the Freikorps. The leaders of the uprising, party leader Karl Liebknecht and Polish-born Jewish theorist Rosa Luxemburg, were hunted down and killed soon after. A similar uprising in the port of Bremen held out for a few weeks. Meanwhile, in the south, the Kingdom of Bavaria had actually fallen a day before the German Empire, with Jewish anti-war activist Kurt Eisner serving as minister-president in Munich until his assassination the following April by Count Anton Arkovalli, a far-right anti-Semitic aristocrat of Jewish descent. Eisner wasn't a communist, but the regime that succeeded him was. 3 days after his murder, communists and anarchists inspired by the success of Béla Kun in Hungary declared the Bavarian Soviet Republic, with not one but 2 successive Jewish leaders in Ernst Toller and Eugen Levine. Given the failures of the earlier Soviets in Berlin and Bremen, many Bavarian communists refused to participate in the Soviet, and Bavaria devolved into a short but bloody civil war. The anti-communists prevailed, and the radical Levine was executed for treason, while the more moderate Toller was imprisoned and eventually returned to public life as a playwright. In the midst of all this chaos, the Council of People's Deputies called elections in January, with a secret ballot, votes for women, and equal voting for all social classes. The liberals and social democrats utterly dominated, and immediately got to work writing a new constitution. But with continued unrest in Berlin, the drafting instead took place in the small town of Weimar, which is why this period is often called the Weimar Republic. Once an unequal federation of kingdoms and fiefdoms, the new constitution reformed Germany into a federation of 25 states, later consolidated to 17. As the communist uprisings began losing steam, the government fully turned its attention to the ongoing Paris Peace Conference. While Germany was excluded from negotiations, the Allies themselves were divided over how the defeated power should be dealt with. France, as I've said before, was out for blood. They'd suffered the majority of fatalities on the Western Front, and even more had come home with permanent disabilities from their wounds. As it so happens, most of France's heavy industry had been located along the Western Front and was now destroyed, compelling France to secure access to German coal and steel. But most of all, Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau's government sought to cripple Germany politically and economically so it could never be a threat again. By contrast, the United States took an idealistic approach, seeking to rehabilitate Germany into a prosperous democratic society that could move beyond its imperial past. Britain's government was more sympathetic to the US position, but was also eager to maintain her alliance with France. As a compromise, the US and UK got France to abandon some of its aims by assigning them a League of Nations mandate in Syria and Lebanon, effectively sacrificing the promise of peace in the Middle East for the promise of peace in Europe. Under the ensuing Treaty of Versailles, Germany ceded Alsace-Lorraine to France and Posen and West Prussia to the new Republic of Poland. Danzig became an internationalized free city, and several border regions were scheduled for plebiscites on whether to remain part of Germany or submit to annexation by neighboring countries. Interestingly, most of them voted to stay in Germany. Belgium received Eupen-Malmedy, while France was given a protectorate over the Saarland and a League of Nations mandate over Memo, which was later handed over to Lithuania. Altogether, Germany lost about 12% of her territory and about 11% of her population. She also lost her colonies in Africa and the Pacific, though they only existed for prestige, and Germany was undoubtedly better off without them. Allied troops were to continue occupying the Rhineland until 1934, and both banks of the river were demilitarized in perpetuity. The sizes of Germany's army and navy were strictly limited. The Air Force, conscription, and chemical weapons were outright banned, and enormous quantities of existing war materiel were to be surrendered. But perhaps most significantly, the treaty compelled Germany to take primary responsibility for the war and ordered it to deliver 20 billion marks in gold, securities, and goods over the next 2 years. Fun fact, these reparations in kind included the patent for aspirin and the SS Mine, the ship on which my family immigrated to the US before the war. Following the initial handover, a commission was established levying an additional 132 billion marks. This was more than Germany's entire GDP in 1919. It's easy to look back and conclude that the dream of a rehabilitated democratic Germany was doomed from the start, but it wasn't for lack of trying. Following the treaty, the Weimar regime held a census for Germany's new borders. And while that census doesn't appear to have broken down the Jewish population, outside estimates, like those of the American Jewish Yearbook, suggest a number close to 500,000, the fifth largest Jewish population in the world, though considerably less than that of the German Empire 5 years earlier. What the Jewish community lost in population, it gained in new social opportunities. Without a monarchist elite enforcing their gentlemen's agreements, a new generation of Jewish artists and intellectuals were welcomed to the forefront of German culture alongside the non-Jewish majority. In just the 5 years after the war's end, 6 Germans received a Nobel Prize, of whom 2 were Jewish and 1 was Jewish-born. In 1918, right at the war's end, Fritz Haber received the prize in chemistry for his discovery of a process for synthesizing ammonia, a key tool for producing fertilizer, increasing food yields, and preventing famine. This was an extremely controversial award because Haber had also been instrumental in Germany's development of chemical weapons and had denied German atrocities on the Western Front. In 1921, Albert Einstein received the prize in physics for his work on the photoelectric effect. And in 1922, biochemist Otto Fritz Meyerhoff received the prize in physiology and medicine alongside British scientist A.V. Hill for discovering the role of oxygen in the production of lactic acid, solving a century-long mystery over how the body converts food into energy. These weren't Germany's first Jewish Nobel laureates, that would be immunologist Paul Ehrlich in 1908, but their careers were emblematic of the challenges Jews had faced under the Empire. Meyerhoff worked in the field of medicine, where the taboo against Jewish researchers was less common. Haber had converted to Lutheranism as a young man just to get his foot in the door. And Einstein had left Germany entirely as a young man, did his most important work in neighboring Switzerland, and only qualified for a professorship in pre-war Germany after becoming the most famous scientist in the world. But now the founders of the Republic could pride themselves that the next generation of German Jewish minds would never have to face those obstacles. Similar changes were going on in the humanities. In 1923, an eccentric Jewish Marxist from Argentina named Felix Weil provided a large endowment to establish the Institute for Social Research at the University of Frankfurt, where it attracted a variety of academics who'd struggled under the empire due to their political views or general prejudice. So naturally, it included a sizable minority of Jewish faculty, such as philosophers Walter Benjamin and Herbert Marcuse, psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, and sociologist Max Horkheimer. Though Weil had intended the institute to promote Marxism, and many of its members were Marxists, the dominant ideology that emerged from the Frankfurt School was instead critical theory, which analyzed society with a focus on power dynamics rather than Marx's materialism. Indeed, even the Marxists of the Frankfurt School weren't afraid to voice their dissatisfaction with Marxism. In an era when faith in rigid ideology was being normalized, critical theory exposed the folly of ideology as a societal cure-all. But I tried reading some of their writing, and as a non-philosophy major, it was unreadable. I don't know why anybody thinks this stuff is so influential. I mean, I do know why, but come on. Much the same phenomenon was playing itself out in the arts. After struggling to break through in the orchestral scene, Jewish composer Kurt Weill formed a lasting partnership with an up-and-coming playwright named Bertolt Brecht. In 1928, their collaboration produced the Threepenny Opera, which included a jazz-influenced English murder ballad called Die Moritat von Mackie Messer. You would know it as Mac the Knife, the most popular German song of the 1920s. While Germany struggled to find its footing in a post-war world, it was unquestionably Europe's leader in the medium of cinema, with Berlin and nearby Potsdam as the main centers of the industry. Only Hollywood could compare, and even then, Germans could boast that the father of Hollywood had been born in Germany. If you have a film degree, you've probably seen at least one movie that was either produced in 1920s Germany or has strong connections to it, and that movie was probably written by Jewish screenwriter Karl Mayer, who first broke out in 1920 with the cabinet of Dr. Caligari and later formed a lucrative partnership with director F.W. Murnau, culminating in the Oscar-winning Sunrise: A Song of Two Humans. Meanwhile, Jewish theater director Max Reinhardt helped inspire the era-defining genre of German Expressionism, while his Gentile protege Paul Wegener helped popularize Jewish folklore in the German mainstream with his film The Golem. Germany's most famous Jewish directors were Richard Oswald and Max Nivelli. Both of these men belonged to the New Objectivity movement, a response to the increasingly surreal expressionism of artists like Murnau and Mayer that tended toward realism and social commentary. Austrian-born Oswald was a crowd-pleasing classicist, mostly directing musicals, literary adaptations, and historical epics, while the Galician-born Nivelli was more experimental and more explicitly political. Though the 1919 Constitution guaranteed freedom of religion and a separation of church and state, religious groups remained federally recognized corporations with the power to collect taxes from affiliated citizens. As far back as 1869, the German Israelite Community Association had attempted to create a truly national religious body, but in practice, Jewish religious governance was mostly on the state or local level. Unlike most of Germany's Christian bodies, the Jewish councils weren't making decisions about religious doctrines or practices, so they were generally very pluralistic. A century earlier, the German Confederation had been the birthplace of modern Orthodox Judaism, conservative Judaism, and both varieties of Reform Judaism. So interaction between them was nothing new. And while some rabbis may have felt alienated from the local councils due to their views, they were never unwelcome, at least in theory. If any person could be singled out as German Judaism's figurehead, it was unquestionably the reformist Leo Baeck, chief rabbi of Berlin under the Empire, a scholar of comparative religion, and a field rabbi during the war. Baeck steadily gained more and more leadership positions in the German Jewish world. But if the 1920s brought new opportunities for German Jews, it provoked a demographic crisis in German Judaism. For reasons I'll explain later, Germany's native-born Jewish population began shrinking in the 1920s. And on top of that, a loophole in the Prussian tax code enabled Jews to avoid paying religious taxes by delisting themselves from their local synagogues without renouncing their Jewish affiliation. As attendance dwindled and tax revenue dried up, synagogues began to downsize or outright close. By 1928, only 1 out of every 1,000 Jewish university students was studying to become a rabbi, compared to 1 out of every 37 Christian students studying to become priests or ministers. At the same time, the Haredi presence was only growing. As early as 1914, a fifth of Germany's Jewish population comprised refugees from the Russian Empire, most of whom were very poor and very religious in a way that was totally alien to Jews born in Germany. The end of the First World War and simultaneous rise of communism in the East drove yet more Haredim to take refuge in Germany, lacking the means to resettle further afield. In some cities, like Leipzig, Jewish refugees from the East now outnumbered native-born Jews. And while the religious councils claimed to welcome their new congregants, they raised intense fears for the future of Germany's liberal Jewish tradition, with councils changing their bylaws to impose new financial or political barriers, either to disenfranchise the so-called black hordes or to coerce them into adopting a more German way of life. In the first decade of the Republic, Jewish voters overwhelmingly favored the political center and center-left. All three of the parties which had led Germany out of the empire had taken a strong stand against anti-Semitism during the war, though none more than the Social Democrats. The German Democratic Party had always enjoyed support from wealthy and middle-class Jews, and by the end of the decade, even the explicitly Catholic Center Party had formed an alliance with modern Orthodox Jewry. By contrast, the center-right German People's Party was always conspicuously tolerant of anti-Semitism within its ranks, and the avowedly monarchist German National People's Party was explicitly anti-Semitic. Like most Leninists of the time, the German communists simply refused to engage with the Jewish question on the principle that it was a bourgeois matter that would disappear under communism. Following the Treaty of Versailles, the government's primary concern became figuring out how to pay off the massive reparations that the treaty imposed. Few nations could have risen to such a challenge, but Germany was in an especially tough spot. Like most countries, Germany had issued bonds to help finance the war. But unlike other countries, they hadn't raised taxes, instead assuming that they'd win the war and could simply recoup the cost by plundering and extorting the defeated allies. As a result, the Reichsbank had taken the gold mark off the gold standard and just started printing money, resulting in high inflation and a colossal national debt. After the war, the Reichsbank attempted to shrink that debt by buying up foreign currency reserves at market rates, deliberately inducing more inflation. And initially, this worked. In the first couple years after the war, GDP and wages actually grew faster in Germany than in France or Belgium. But by 1923, Germany could no longer maintain the reparations payments, leading France and Belgium to occupy the cluster of industrial cities known as the Ruhr and hold it as collateral. The government ordered citizens to resist the occupation by continuing as normal, paying their wages by printing even more money, at which point inflation finally spun out of control. In January 1922, $1 was worth 49 marks. In January 1923, it was worth 49,000 marks. In November 1923, it was worth 4.2 trillion marks. No one in Germany was untouched by the effects of hyperinflation, but the middle class was hit especially hard since so much of their wealth was in pensions and savings accounts now rendered worthless. And because the Jewish population was disproportionately middle class, the community was profoundly impacted by its decline. Poverty and unemployment rates skyrocketed among the Jewish population while university attendance plummeted. Jewish charities originally set up to help refugees fleeing Eastern Europe were suddenly overwhelmed by the needs of their own countrymen. In Berlin, the suicide rate was higher among Jews than any other religious group. At the same time, the birth rate was collapsing. By 1922, more Jews in Prussia were dying than being born. Under these desperate circumstances, people got creative. Zionism, which had previously been on the very fringe of German Jewish political thought, suddenly began to gain traction among the younger generation. Similarly, a movement arose encouraging Jews to take up farming within Germany, led by a coalition of Zionists, Orthodox rabbis, and Jewish veterans organizations headed by sociologist Franz Oppenheimer. 2 experimental farms were established, but in a sector already suffering from too many farmers and too little land, the movement was destined to fail. From the moment reparations were first imposed, Germany's new regime had predicted that they could renegotiate in the coming years, earning the Allies' trust as the economy improved and the memory of the war became more distant. But for a particular minority of citizens, the mere act of negotiating had been a national betrayal. It was a time of radicalization. It should be no surprise that support for the communists began to rebound nationwide, but just as the communists abandoned political violence, Germany faced a new and more terroristic wave on the opposite end of the spectrum. From the moment the war ended, monarchist and folkist hardliners had been organizing, and now they would make their presence known. Blame for Germany's defeat in the Great War varied wildly. The greatest object of scorn by far was the monarchy. The monarchist parties could never win more than 1/3 of the popular vote in any national election, and they probably only got that much despite their monarchism. As in most of the world, the Great War permanently shifted cultural ideas about war and the people who fought in them, making the empire's generals a popular punching bag on the center left. Only Germany's chief general, Paul von Hindenburg, had avoided the worst of this sentiment by cooperating with the new government. Eventually, in 1925, he was elected president. You could hardly find a greater contrast than Hindenburg's old accomplice, Erich Ludendorff. Back during the war, Ludendorff had led the attempt to break through the Western Front and capture Paris, only to preside over the disintegration of the German armies in the face of an Allied breakthrough. In the final days of the war, Germany's transitional government had forced Ludendorff to resign. But within a year, Ludendorff had insisted that Germany had been on the cusp of total victory only to be stabbed in the back by revolution on the home front, later joining other deposed officers and politicians in a coup attempt to establish a military dictatorship. It was to be the first of many. It isn't hard to see how the idea of a German army stabbed in the back would revitalize the accusations against Jews that had taken place during the war. In 1919, Alfred Roth of the anti-Semitic mystic lobby Reichshammerbund published a purported analysis of data collected in the Judendzählung, stating that Jews had disproportionately avoided military service or had avoided service on the front lines. Leaving aside the extreme flaws in both the methodology and scope of the original survey, whose results were never published and are now lost, Roth's analysis was rife with logical fallacies. In 1922, sociologists Franz Oppenheimer and Jakob Segal published their own analysis of independently collected data showing that Jewish participation in the war had been roughly on par with the general population. But for those looking for the Jew to blame, no further thought was required. Though the stab-in-the-back myth would take many forms, the anti-Semitic angle would prove one of the most potent. And in 1922, it took its highest-profile victim. Walther Rathenau was a physicist and engineer from an unusually wealthy Jewish family in Berlin. Like the rest of his family, he was an assimilationist who would occasionally speak disparagingly of Jewish culture, but he was nevertheless loyal to his Jewishness. As both a soldier and an academic, he'd been given the choice to convert to Lutheranism in order to advance his career, and both times he'd refused. During the Great War, with the traditional barriers to Jews suspended, Rathenau had been appointed to oversee the collection of raw materials for the war effort, but resigned due to the anti-Semitism he still faced in the War Office. After the war, Rathenau soon found himself back in government, overseeing Germany's post-war reconstruction. As I've said, the reconstruction was a great success, in no small part due to Rathenau's planning. But Rathenau had bigger plans to restore Germany into a great power, which came to the forefront in his new role as foreign minister. Just 2 months into the job, Rathenau signed the Second Treaty of Versailles, in which Germany and Soviet Russia renounced all of their extant disputes and made a comprehensive peace. Though Rathenau was an anti-communist who favored greater German integration with Western Europe, he hoped that flexing some diplomatic muscle would convince Britain and France to renegotiate Germany's onerous reparation payments. And though the British and French governments regarded the treaty with suspicion, Rathenau's tact, eloquence, and sincere commitment to peace in Europe earned him their utmost respect. Less than 4 years after the World War, Germany had regained its seat at the table. Back home, Rathenau's allies regarded him as little less than the second coming of Bismarck, Germany's new man of destiny. But to the monarchist opposition and the ultranationalist underground, for whom any normalization was treason, normalization with the Soviet Union was a confirmation of every fear of which they'd convinced themselves. Just a month after returning from Italy, Rathenau was gunned down and killed on his morning commute. The assassins were quickly exposed as members of Organisation Konsul, a far-right militia which had already murdered office holders, including one of Rathenau's fellow ministers, and soon after attempted to kill former Chancellor Scheidemann. Of the 3 young men who had orchestrated Rathenau's death, one was killed in a shootout with police and one committed suicide. Only the getaway driver, 21-year-old Ernst Werner Techow, was tried and convicted. At his trial, Techow claimed that Rathenau had to be killed on the basis that he was one of the fictitious Elders of Zion purported by Russian monarchists to secretly rule the world, that Rathenau's sister was married to Soviet agent provocateur Karl Radek, that Rathenau had secretly negotiated an agreement with Britain for the Jewish takeover of the world, and that he was an unqualified diversity hire who'd blackmailed his way into government. That none of these things were true didn't matter. That Rathenau had advocated for Jewish assimilation didn't matter. That he'd been a resolute anti-communist didn't matter. That he'd even opposed the armistice ending the war didn't matter. In the eyes of his killers, a Jew was a Jew, and a Jew could not be German. Rathenau's death was received with nationwide mourning and a renewed sense of patriotism, as the mainstream stiffened its back against right-wing extremism. Monarchist politicians who'd previously demonized Rathenau were jeered in Berlin as accomplices to murder. After just 4 weeks, the Reichstag passed the Law for the Protection of the Republic, which allowed the government to ban organizations opposed to the constitutional order, and define violence committed against that order as a higher class of crime subject to stronger penalties and trial by a special people's court. The following year, this law would be put to the ultimate test. And it would fail. Around this time, Benito Mussolini's fascist party came to power in Italy by seizing government offices and forcing the Italian king to award them a mandate to govern. This new fascist ideology combined ultranationalism, authoritarianism, the desire to conquer promised or lost lands, and a state-oriented corporate economy which opposed both capitalism and socialism. And by 1920, Germany's Volkists had produced their own fascist movement, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, which incorporated Völkisch ideas of German racial superiority to form a movement that centered the Jews as the source of everything they sought to eradicate. In late 1923, the Nazis planned to follow Mussolini's example and stage a coup in Berlin. But due to the recent unrest, the state of Bavaria, where they were headquartered, had declared a state of emergency similar to martial law, with State Commissioner Gustav Ritter von Kahr exercising dictatorial powers to shut down rebel organizations. So on the 8th of November, the Nazis joined forces with an increasingly deranged Ludendorff, leading 2,000 paramilitaries to seize Kahr and most of the state cabinet during a public meeting at Munich's largest beer hall. Their goal was to force Kahr into accepting Nazi rule in Bavaria, from which they would mount an invasion of Prussia and do the same in Berlin. Though they succeeded in seizing the beer hall, the coup attempt failed. By morning, state police had coordinated with the local army garrison to seize the beer hall back. Kahr repudiated the Nazis, whose leader Adolf Hitler was arrested and later convicted of treason under the new law along with several of his close advisors. But it wasn't the total victory for democracy that the law had intended. Hitler successfully used the trial to generate publicity for the party. The presiding judge sentenced him to a mere 5 years at Landsberg prison under minimum security. He was released after serving just 8 months of his sentence, which he'd used to compose his manifesto Mein Kampf. Several of Hitler's allies were convicted with no sentence whatsoever. Others evaded capture, and Ludendorff, who feigned ignorance of the plot and claimed to only be there by coincidence, was acquitted, whereafter he took Hitler's place as leader of a Nazi-dominated alliance and led it into its first national election. The same month as the beer hall putsch, the German government finally put an end to hyperinflation. A new transitional currency was introduced in the Rentenmark before introducing the gold-backed Reichsmark. Passive resistance in the Ruhr was called off, and Germany's years-long dream of renegotiation began. Though the United States had taken an isolationist turn since the war, the violence of 1923 had raised fears in Washington that a communist or fascist takeover of Germany would stop reparations payments entirely and spark another European war. So in concert with the former Western allies, American banker and diplomat Charles Dawes led negotiations to refinance reparations and, by extension, save German democracy. But before that could happen, Germany was scheduled to hold federal elections, with the Dawes Committee as the top campaign issue. Just 5 days before Election Day, the committee released a report recommending the restructuring of the Reichsbank under international supervision, including an 800 million mark loan sourced by the United States from private lenders, a slowdown in reparations payments, whose amount would also be tied to the overall performance of Germany's economy, and the withdrawal of all foreign troops from the Ruhr. The plan was endorsed by the ruling center-right coalition as well as the Social Democrats, but rejected by the Communists, while the Nazis and monarchist DNVP rejected any reparations whatsoever. Ultimately, it would depend on the voters. With large gains by the Nazis, monarchists, and communists, Germany now had to contend with a minority government. But that government held its ground and was just barely able to secure the necessary 2/3 vote to implement the Dawes Plan. In snap elections that December, the mainstream parties rebounded, and in 1926, Germany finally joined the League of Nations. As the country stabilized, support for the Nazis collapsed, with Hitler routinely mocked in the media as a has-been charlatan and borderline cult leader. In the US, Dawes was elected vice president and won the Nobel Peace Prize. For the rest of the decade, Germany enjoyed its golden 20s as a world leader in culture, art, science, technology, and academics. The nightmare was over. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed, setting off a domino effect that resulted in the largest loss of capital in world history, the Great Depression. As governments around the world scrambled to protect their economies from the impacts of the global crisis, they mostly implemented policies that exacerbated it, and Germany was no exception. The previous year, the Social Democrats had swept into power on a wave of popular support and negotiated even more reductions in reparations payments, for which they were maneuvered out of power by their conservative coalition partners. Fixated on balancing the federal budget, the conservatives then proposed a series of unpopular austerity measures which only threatened to tank the economy further, provoking a backlash in the Reichstag and early elections. With no viable path to a coalition, the conservative minority government persisted. But more importantly, the Nazis were suddenly the second largest party. What happened? Unlike most far-right movements of the Weimar era, the Nazis weren't monarchists, a subtle but important difference. With the exception of Ludendorff, the party's leading figures were all young, middle-class, and not particularly tied to the legacy of the empire, which meant they were never too good to court voters. Hitler was especially good at this, rehearsing his poses and emotional flourishes before going out to make public speeches. Because of this, the public, who were never that well versed in the party's platform, saw in him what they wanted to see and heard what they wanted to hear. While race and anti-Semitism were at the center of Nazi ideology, most Nazi political speeches didn't center it in their rhetoric. And besides, anti-Semitism was such a regular feature on the German right that most people simply brushed it off. Despite their fixation with Bavaria as the ideal expression of German culture, most early support for the Nazis came from Protestant farmers and small business owners in the rural north and east. Nevertheless, a conventional wisdom existed, encouraged by their own carefully crafted image, that the Nazis were primarily a party of urban workers whose success threatened the survival of the left. As Germany's biggest and most popular party, the SPD didn't buy into this. but the communists absolutely did. One sector where the Nazis and communists were able to make inroads was universities, with Nazi-sympathizing fraternities organizing protests against the hiring of Jewish teachers and professors like Albert Einstein, whom they derided as underqualified diversity hires. So even before the Nazis had emerged as the premier Völkisch movement, future KPD leader Ruth Fischer had suggested that the Völkisch might be willing to ally with communism against Jewish capitalists. Fischer, whose father and boyfriend were Jewish, wasn't condoning anti-Semitism by any means, but her statements at the time were certainly received that way, and communist visions of an alliance with the far right were short-lived. In 1925, the Communist International removed Fischer from KPD leadership over her hostility to new Soviet Supreme Leader Joseph Stalin. In her place came Ernst Thälmann, under whom the party began purging Jewish members who were critical of Stalin and steadily removing Jews from party lists overall. By 1932, the Communist caucus in the Reichstag was entirely Gentile. They did increase their vote share, but the Nazis were now the largest party. Though Germany had experienced minority governments throughout the Republican period, most of those governments had been able to rely on outside support in certain situations. Now, however, it was mathematically impossible to pass any legislation without the support of either the Nazis or the Communists. In response, Chancellor Franz von Papen organized a coalition between the Nazis and the monarchist DNVP. Germany's political culture was uniquely unprepared to deal with this. President Hindenburg, Chancellor Papen, and their monarchist allies had always preferred military dictatorship over democracy, and to that end they saw Hitler as a useful idiot whose support and organization could be weaponized to increase their own power before quietly discarding him. The Communists, meanwhile, focused their outrage on the Social Democrats, claiming that they were little different from the Nazis. Returning the favor, the SPD created the platform of the Three Arrows: against monarchism, against Nazism, and against communism. With unemployment reaching 24%, the Social Democrats were confident that the Nazis and monarchists' failure to deliver the country from the Depression would leave them as the only viable governing party. But when new elections were called after just 4 months, it was the communists who profited most. Dissatisfied with Papen's management, Hindenburg replaced him with General Kurt von Schleicher and essentially began ruling by decree. Germany's Jewish establishment were no more suited to realize the direness of the situation. Casual anti-Semitism was so normalized that most Jews had simply learned to tune it out. Anti-Semitic violence in Germany was rare, usually confined to rural communities where most Jews didn't live, and was always treated as a crime to be prosecuted rather than a social ill to be reformed. Throughout its existence, the Nazi Party had decried Jews as enemies of Germany and vowed to revoke their citizenship. But since no German political party had ever won a majority in the Reichstag, this was viewed as a worst-case scenario. Even after the coalition under Papen, most Jewish publications agreed that the Nazis would be too incompetent and too overwhelmed by the complexities of government to carry out their anti-Jewish agenda. That isn't to say that a Jewish response to Nazism didn't exist. The Central Association of German Citizens of Jewish Faith, or Zentralverein, had been fighting anti-Semitism through education, legal advocacy, political lobbying, public protest, and self-defense activities since the 1890s, and were now joined in their efforts by the National Federation of Jewish Frontline Soldiers, or Reichsbund. Together, they helped defend the Jews of Berlin against Nazi-affiliated riots in 1923, 1927, and 1931. Neither were Jewish groups alone in condemning the anti-Semitism of the Nazis. Both of Germany's main Christian denominations had Nazi sympathizers and opponents. But while Lutheran theologians spoke out for and against the Nazis in roughly equal numbers, Catholic priests were much more likely to publicly oppose the Nazis than to support them. At the time, Protestants in Germany outnumbered Catholics by 2-1, making Catholics a distinct minority. And this was a major reason why opposition to Nazism was strongest in majority Catholic regions. Nevertheless, Jewish organizations fighting against anti-Semitism often struggled due to lack of money and infighting over strategy. Most controversially, much of the Reichsbund's response focused on Jewish self-discipline, educating Jews, especially women and young adults, to avoid stereotypical behavior like being overweight, wearing too much jewelry, or acting too emotionally in the workplace. The view from the rival Zentralverein ranged from sympathy to outright contempt, but even the CV's director had to admit that racism wasn't fair. Stepchildren must be doubly good. Believing he could control Hitler and manipulate him to his own ends, Papen arranged a second alliance with the Nazis wherein Hitler would serve as chancellor and Papen as vice-chancellor. Hindenburg, having lost confidence in General Schleicher, was persuaded to appoint Hitler as Germany's head of government on the 30th of January 1933. New elections were called for March. In the weeks leading up to the vote, the Nazi paramilitaries SA and SS initiated a wave of violence and intimidation against trade unions and other political parties in order to suppress voter turnout. 6 days before Election Day, someone set fire to the Reichstag building, destroying most of its interior. The main suspect in the fire was a Dutch communist, and while the historical verdict on his guilt is murky at best, Hitler convinced President Hindenburg that the fire had been part of a wider communist plot to overthrow the government. So the next day, Hindenburg used his emergency powers to issue a decree suspending freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, habeas corpus, privacy of communications, and freedom against warrantless search and seizure. The decree specifically targeted communists, anarchists, and social democrats. Ernst Thälmann was the first party leader to be arrested. On the night of the 5th of March, the votes came in. The Nazis and the DNVP finally had their majority. Before the end of 1933, they would call just one more election. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, David Ben Yosef, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, Andrew Ettinger, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osha Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Jacob Kossoff, Milk and Honey, David Safarian, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.